Warning, this podcast contains descriptions of murder, torture and abuse. As a result, it may not be suitable for everybody. Chicago, Illinois, USA. The most populous city in the US state of Illinois and the third most populous city in the United States. It has an estimated population of 2.6 million. It's also the most populous city in the Midwestern United States. Chicago is the county seat of Cook County and second most populous county in the US, while a small portion of the city's O'Hare Airport also extends into DuPage County. Chicago is the principal city of Chicago Metropolitan Area, defined either as the US Census Bureau's Metropolitan Statistical Area or the Combined Statistical Area, often called Chicagoland. It constitutes the third most populous urban area in the United States after New York City and Los Angeles. Listen to the hometown murder case of Richard Speck, an American mass murderer who systematically raped, won and tortured and murdered 8 student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital on the 9th of July 13th into the early hours of July 14th, 1966. Richard Benjamin Speck, born December 6, 1941 and died 5th of December 1991, was an American mass murderer who systematically raped, won and tortured and murdered 8 student nurses from Chicago Community Hospital. He was convicted at trial and sentenced to death, but the sentence was later overturned due to issues with jury selection at the trial. Speck died of a heart attack in 1991 after 25 years in prison. In 1996, videotapes featuring Speck were shown before the Illinois State Legislature to highlight some of the illegal activity that took place in prisons. Richard Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois, the 7th of 8 children of Benjamin Franklin Speck and Mary Margaret Carver. The family moved to Monmouth, Illinois shortly after Speck's birth. Speck and his younger sister Caroline was both much younger than their 4 older sisters and 2 older brothers. Speck's eldest brother Robert died at the age of 23 in an automobile accident in 1952. Speck's father worked as a packer at Western Stoneware in Monmouth and had previously worked as a farmer and lodger. Speck was very close to his father, who died in 1947 from a heart attack at the age of 53. Speck was 6 years old at the time. A few years later, Speck's religious teetotaler mother fell in love with a travelling insurance salesman from Texas, Carl August Randolph Lindbergh, who she met on a train trip to Chicago. The hard-drinking Lindbergh, with a 25-year criminal record that started with forgery and included several arrests for drunk driving, was the opposite of Speck's sober, hard-working father. Speck's mother married Lindbergh on May 10, 1950 in Palo Pinto, Texas. Speck and his younger sister Caroline stayed with their married sister Sarah Norton in Monmouth for a few months so Speck could finish 2nd grade before joining their mother and Lindbergh in rural Santo, Texas, 40 miles west of Fort North, Texas, where Speck attended 3rd grade. After a year in Santo, Speck moved with his mother, stepfather and sister to East Dallas section of Dallas, Texas, living at 10 addresses in poor neighborhoods over the next dozen years. Speck loathed his often drunk and frequently absent stepfather, who psychologically abused him with insults and threats. Speck, a poor student who needed glasses for reading but refused to wear them, struggled through Dallas public schools from 4th through 8th grade, repeating the 8th grade at J.L. Long Junior High School, in part because he refused to speak in class because of lifelong fear of people staring at him. In autumn 1957, Speck started 9th grade at Crozier Technical High School but failed every subject and did not return for the second semester in January 1958, dropping out just after his 16th birthday. Speck started drinking alcohol at the age of 12, and by the age of 15 he was getting drunk almost every day. His first arrest in 1955 at the age of 13 for trespassing was followed by dozens of other arrests for misdemeanors over the next 8 years. Speck worked as a labourer for 7-Up Bottling Company in Dallas for almost 3 years, from 1960 to 1963. In October 1961, Speck met 15-year-old Shirley Annette Malone at the Texas State Fair. She became pregnant after 3 weeks of dating him. Shirley married Speck on January 19, 1962, and initially moved in with him, his mother, sister, Caroline, and Caroline's husband. Speck's mother and stepfather had separated. His stepfather had moved to California. Speck stopped using the name Benjamin Lingard, but got married and began using his real name, Richard Benjamin Speck. When their daughter Robbie Lynn Speck was born on July 5, 1962, Malone did not know that Speck was serving a 22-day jail sentence for disturbing the peace in McKinney, Texas, after a drunken melee. Mindblown History is a new historical podcast. It's from the makers of Hometown Murders and Brief History podcast. It's quick 5 minutes historical podcast, only 2 episodes a week, and you'll get your interesting facts and figures about history. Listen now anywhere you listen to your podcasts. Speck stayed with his sister Martha Thornton and her family in Chicago for a few days, then returned to his boyhood hometown of Monmouth, Illinois, where he initially stayed with his old family friends. Speck's brother Howard was a carpenter in Monmouth and found a job for him sanding plasterboard for another Monmouth carpenter. Speck became angry when he learned his ex-wife had remarried 2 days after he granted a divorce. On March 16, 1966, he moved to Christie Hotel in downtown Monmouth on March 25th and spent most of his time in the downtown taverns. At the end of March, while Speck and some acquaintances were on a bar-hopping trip to Gulfport, Illinois, they were detained overnight by police. Thereafter, Speck reportedly threatened a man in a tavern restroom with a knife. On April 19, 1966, Speck returned to stay at his sister Martha's second-floor apartment at 3966 North Avondale Avenue in Old Irving Park neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago, where she lived with her husband, Gene Thornton, and their 2 teenage daughters. Martha has worked as a registered nurse in pediatrics before she was married, and her husband Gene worked nights as a railway switchman. Speck told them an unbelievable story about having to leave Monmouth after refusing to sell narcotics for a crime syndicate there. Gene Thornton, who had served in the US Navy, thought that the US Merchant Marine might provide a suitable occupation for his unemployed brother-in-law. So on April 25th, he took Speck to the US Coast Guard office to apply for a letter of authority to work as an apprentice seaman. The application required being fingerprinted and photographed and having a physical examination by a doctor. Speck found work immediately after obtaining a letter of authority, joining the 33-member crew of Inland Steel's Clarence B. Randall and L6 SB1 class bulk or lake freighter on April 30th. Speck's first voyage on the Clarence B. Randall was brief, since he was stricken with appendicitis on May 3rd and was evacuated by US Coast Guard helicopter to St. Joseph's Hospital in Hancock, Michigan, on the Kanawha Peninsula of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where he had emergency surgery. After he was discharged from hospital, Speck returned to stay with his sister Martha and her family in Chicago to recuperate. On May 20th, he rejoined the crew of Clarence B. Randall, on which he served until June 14th, when he got drunk and quarrelled with one of the boat's officers and was put ashore on June 15th. For the following week, Speck stayed at the St. Elmo at Eastside Chicago Flophouse at East 99th Street and South Ewing Avenue. Speck then travelled by train to Houghton, Michigan, staying at the Douglas House to visit Judy Lacanimi, a 28-year-old nurse's aide going through a divorce, whom he had befriended at St. Joseph's Hospital. On June 27th, after Judy gave him $80 to help him until he found work, Speck left him to again stay with his sister Martha and her family in Chicago for the next 2 weeks. On June 30th, Speck's brother-in-law Gene drove him to the National Maritime Union hiring hall in Jeffrey Manor neighborhood of St. Deering, Chicago, to file his paperwork for a seaman's card. The hiring hall was 1 block east of 5 attached 2-story brick townhouses, 3 of which were occupied by South Chicago Community Hospital senior student nurses and Filipino exchange registered nurses. 8 of these nurses lived in the easternmost townhouse from the hiring hall. At 11 p.m. on July 13th, 1966, Speck broke into the townhouse in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood. The townhouse was functioning as a dormitory for student nurses. He entered and, using only a knife, killed Gloria Davy, Patricia Matsuzek, Nina Josiamo, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Farris, Mary Ann Jordan, Melita Garlula, Vientina Passion. Speck, who later claimed he was both drunk and high on drugs, may have originally planned to commit a routine burglary. Speck held the women in a room for hours, leading them out one by one, stabbing or strangling each to death, then finally raping and strangling his last victim, Gloria Davy. One woman, Corazano Amara, escaped death because she crawled and hid under a bed while Speck was out of the room. Speck possibly lost count or might have known 8 women lived in the townhouse, but was unaware that a 9th woman was spending the night. And Maria stayed hidden until almost 6 a.m. Fingerprints found at the scene was matched to Speck's. 2 days after the murders, Speck was identified by a drifter named Claude Lunsford. Speck, Lunsford and another man had been drinking the evening of the July 15th on the fire escape of the Star Hotel. On July 16th, Lunsford recognised the sketch of the murderer in the evening paper and phoned police at 9:30 p.m. after finding Speck in his room at the Star Hotel. The police, however, did not respond to the call, although their records showed that the call had been made. Speck then attempted suicide, and the Star Hotel desk clerk phoned in the emergency around midnight. Speck was taken to Cook County Hospital at 12:30 a.m. on July 17th. At the hospital, Speck was recognised by Dr. Leroy Smith, a 25-year-old surgical resident physician who had read about the Born to Raise Hell tattoo in a newspaper story. The police were called. Speck was arrested. Concerns over the recent Miranda case that had vacated the convictions of a number of the criminals meant Speck was not even questioned for 3 weeks after his arrest. Speck later claimed he had no recollection of the murders, but he confessed to the crime to Dr. Leroy Smith at Cork County Hospital. Smith did not testify because the confession was made while Speck was sedated. Illinois Supreme Court Justice John S. Stamos, Cook County's state attorney when Speck was tried, who knew the hospital confession, stated, quote, "We didn't need it. We had an eyewitness," end quote. Speck confessed to the murders in the first time in public when he spoke to Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene in 1978. In a film Inmates made at the Stateville Correctional Center in 1988, Speck recounted the brutal murders in detail. He again stated he was high that night, but then he undercut the idea that the drugs were a mitigating factor, asserting he could just have done it sober. Speck's jury trial began April 3, 1967 in Peoria, Illinois, 3 hours southwest of Chicago, with a gag order on the press. In court, Speck was positively identified by the sole surviving student nurse. When Amura was asked if she could identify the killer of her fellow students, Amura rose from her seat in the witness box, walked directly in front of Speck and pointed her finger at him, nearly touching him, and said, quote, "This is the man," end quote. Lieutenant Emil Gies testified regarding the fingerprints that were matched. On April 15th, after 49 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Speck guilty and recommended the death penalty. On June 5th, Judge Herbert J. Passion sentenced Speck to die in the electric chair, but granted immediate stay pending automatic appeal. The Illinois Supreme Court subsequently upheld his conviction and the death sentence on November 22, 1968. On June 28, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Speck's conviction but reversed his death sentence because more than 250 potential jurors were unconstitutionally exiled from the jury because of their conscientious or religious beliefs against capital punishment. The case was remanded back to the Illinois Supreme Court for resentencing. On June 29, 1972, in Furman versus Georgia, the US Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional, so Illinois Supreme Court only option was to order Speck resentenced to prison by the original Cook County Court. On November 21, 1972, in Peoria, Judge Richard Fitzgerald resentenced Speck to from 400 to 1,200 years in prison, 8 consecutive sentences of 50 to 150 years. He was denied parole in 7 minutes after his first parole hearing on September 15, 1976, and its 6 subsequent hearings in 1977, 78, 81, 84, 87 and 92. Shortly before December 5, 1991, Speck was transported from Stateville Correctional Center to Silver Cross Hospital in Joliet, Illinois, after complaining of severe chest pains late Wednesday evening. Speck later died in the early morning hours of December 5th of what was some to be believed to be a heart attack, 1 day shy of what had been his 50th birthday. The coroner stated that Speck had an enlarged heart, emphysema and clogged arteries, which most likely contributed to his fatal heart attack. Speck's sister feared that his grave would be desecrated, so he does not have a physical resting place. Speck was cremated and his ashes were scattered in secret location in the Joliet area. Thank you for listening to this episode. This is a Need Media production. We produce Hometown Murders, Mind-Blown History and a Brief History podcast. The episode is written and hosted by myself, Andrew Knight, and music, sound and editing is by Harry Edmondson.